On the 15th of May 1967, 16 US Air Force pilots assembled for the first time at Phan Rang. They weren't a motley crew. In fact, they were very obviously some of the finest aviators then operating in Southeast Asia. Each was a volunteer from the F-100 squadrons operating in Vietnam, even though the mission was top secret to begin with and they didn't know what they were getting into, besides that it was 60 missions or 4 months. The entry requirements, initially at least, were 25 combat missions and 1,000 flying hours. Each pilot had to have achieved flight leader status. And that was just as well. They were about to embark on what was statistically the most dangerous fast jet mission in Vietnam. By the time that Commando Sabre wound down in May 1970, over 30% of the 157 aviators who took part had been shot down, some of them twice. 7 pilots died and 4 were POWs, some for more than 5 years. These 16 pilots were the first cadre who would perform this dangerous and until recently largely unheralded mission. They were the Misty FACs, and what they did was to deny the North Vietnamese sanctuaries from the dense foliage in which they operated in the southern route packs. What they also did was pave the way for the formidable US Air Force of today. The genesis of Commando Sabre was an urgent need to detect North Vietnamese troops and supplies moving down through Route Pack 1 and the Echo area of Steel Tiger to the VC units in the south. Strike aircraft like the Thud and the Phantom flew too fast and too high to scan for the telltale signs of enemy activity, and in any case they lacked the fuel to loiter when heavily loaded with weapons. U-2 and RF-101 Voodoo recon aircraft had the camera resolution to allow for detection of the hidden trucks and carts, but by the time their photos had been processed and analysed, it could be days before the findings were in the hands of field commanders. Prior to 1966, this mission had also been the responsibility of forward air controllers in their light aircraft, but intensifying concentrations of AAA and even SAMs arriving in the area meant that by the middle of 1966, the mission was just too dangerous even for the legendarily risk-taking FACs. The situation reached a head when a staff officer from 7th Air Force went up in a 2-ship formation with another bird dog to see things for himself. The leading O-1 was promptly blown to bits by a SAM right in front of his eyes. The slow FACs were withdrawn south of the DMZ for their own safety. That left a critical gap in recon coverage and control. Major Jim Chestnut, the Director of Combat Tactics at 7th Air Force in Saigon, advocated the need for a faster and more survivable aircraft to perform this role. He was supported in this by General Momeyer, who became a crucial supporter and defender of Misty in the coming years. The vexing issue was which jet to choose for the job. As was regularly the case at this stage of the war, the most available, and in reality the most expendable aircraft was an F-100 Super Sabre. In this case, it was the 2-seat family model of the Hun, the F-100F. Major George Day, better known as Bud, was the commander for the initial trial period. When it proved successful, the mission was formalized and the detachment moved to Phu Cat in June. All FACs need a call sign. Because Bud Day's wife was a fan of the Johnny Mathis song Misty, they went with that, despite there being precisely no similarities between that number and what those pilots were setting out to do. Day himself fell victim to the risks when he was shot down on his 23rd mission on August the 26th, 1967. He was captured, badly injured, but managed to escape. Embarking on an excruciating trek south, he came within half a mile of freedom but was recaptured. He then spent 6 years as a POW and was awarded the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary bravery. Although this wasn't the best start, it was already clear that Misty could do something that the Air Force's other recon and air control assets couldn't. In Misty configuration, the F-100F's inboard pylons were removed, leaving 4 pylons on the aircraft, on which would hang 2 drop tanks and 2 7-shot rocket pods containing smoke rockets for marking targets. The F-100F also carried two 20mm M39 cannons with 100 rounds each. Not a lot of ordnance, but the FAC's job was to find the enemy, not to kill him. Although their top secret designation gave the impression of a slick operation, and the pilots were highly skilled, Misty was rather disorganized in 1967. The idea of a fast forward air controller was a new one, and there were no tactics manuals to draw from. Even the aircraft were scratched together from the four wings of Super Sabres deployed to Southeast Asia. Each of them had a two-seater alongside their D or C models, and those aircraft were used for training. Commando Sabre borrowed them. They didn't always return them. What Misty provided to the most aggressive pilots and those who were most committed to winning the war was a chance to use their skills to the full. Because they flew alone over enemy territory, there was no one to monitor the maneuvers they used or the risks they took. Their job was to find the enemy and then to set him up for attack by the strikers fragged to Misty. Staying within arbitrary flying rules set from Saigon or stateside was not part of the job, or rather, it was impossible for them to be monitored. Top secret or not, word soon got out that if you wanted to do more than bomb bits of jungle, then Misty was the place to fly. Within months, its reputation began to grow and volunteers started to come forward. Although Colonel Schneider, the wing commander at Phuket, was frequently driven to apoplexy by his aircraft coming back full of holes, he knew that Momai loved the intelligence that Misty started to produce. So an uneasy truce developed between Schneider and Misty. In fairness to the good colonel, hindsight suggests that he was mostly concerned with keeping the pilots alive, which is a perfectly reasonable thing for somebody in his position to do. Those pilots were, after all, throwing themselves about at low level over unknown defences. No one really kept tabs on enemy activity in Route Pack 1, and it turned out that there were many misconceptions about the volume and nature of supplies and personnel being moved. In the early days, the pilots would paste maps of North Vietnam to the walls of their command post, and then they asked 7th Air Force in Saigon for any intelligence that they had every day. It was pretty clear from the outset that the Mistys had more intel than 7th Air Force. And as they flew long missions at low altitude over the area, the pilots began to build up an even deeper knowledge of the terrain in Route Pack 1 and Steel Tiger. They also began to get a sense of how the enemy there operated. They began sending back photos, and some of those photos would ultimately find their way to the White House. The average mission consisted of flying north about 30 minutes from Phuket into Route Pack 1 or Echo, depending on the weather. They would then enter the route pack and try to locate trucks, truck parks, pole stores, and so on. The pilot was in the front seat, the guy in back, also a pilot, had the maps and the radios. Later, he would be issued with a high-tech analog enemy position reporting device. The designation for this specialized equipment was 35mm Nikon camera. But the Misty's most effective sensor was what they termed Misty eyes. Having stared at that jungle for so many hours, they learned to see the patches where the trees had been disturbed to hide something man-made. The trick was to spot those places and then to fly casually right on by so that the North Vietnamese wouldn't suspect they'd been spotted. Whereas strike aircraft were instructed to stay above 4,000 feet, the Mistys went in much lower, sometimes down to 100 feet, trying to look under the trees. That exposed the F-100s to much heavier ground fire than they experienced in the close air support mission they performed down south. So newly arriving pilots needed to be trained to recognize the different types of guns, as trigger-happy gunners often gave away both their own positions and that of whatever interesting thing they were protecting. So the experienced pilots took the new guys up with them in the back seat for the first 6 missions, and then they alternated between front and back seats for the next 6. To help with the training, the Mistys had identified some gunners who were particularly bad shots, and they deliberately didn't kill those gunners because they were valuable training aids for threat identification. In 1967, at least, the threat to aircraft was in the form of rapid-firing gun systems directed by eye. The large-caliber radar-directed guns in the SAMs had not yet penetrated south because they were needed to defend Hanoi and Haiphong. But what the AA gunners lacked in technology, they made up for in volume and enthusiasm. The largest gun regularly found in Route Pack 1 was the 57mm S60. It was based on the German 55mm automatic flak cannon from the Second World War, and it was deadly if it was employed by a well-trained crew. The S-60 fired a 6-pound shell with a proximity fuse at a maximum rate of 120 rounds a minute. The shells were loaded manually from 4-round clips. Each of the clips weighed about 36 pounds, so it was a bit of a physical job. As a result, load of fatigue and other factors started to limit the gun's sustained rate of fire, and you usually got about 70 rounds per minute. Maximum effective altitude was 28,000 feet, horizontal range was about 12,000 meters, but the gun really was only used for low altitude engagements, and the batteries would open fire at ranges of about 4,000 meters, maybe up to 6,000. They would fire on targets operating below 5,000 feet, which of course covered everything the Mistys were doing. The 57mm guns would usually be deployed in groups of 4, and they were used only around high-value targets. They weren't radar directed in the south. The Vietnamese would get about 1,000 guns, but they only had a few of the flat wheel or fire can radars to direct them, and they kept those north. Next, most powerful and significantly more numerous were 37mm M38-39 guns. North Vietnam acquired about 2,500 of those from the Soviet Union and China. They were quite an old weapon by this point. They were introduced in 1938. It had been the Soviet Union's primary AAA weapon in the Second World War. You had to fire the M38-39 over an open gun sight. There was no option for radar fire control. There was a manual range predictor that allowed you to determine the target range and altitude, and then theoretically told you when to open fire. In most engagements, the entire 6-gun battery would mass its fire against the lead aircraft. Sometimes each gun crew would choose individual targets and engage independently, but it was an inaccurate weapon, so that was less effective. M38-39 fired about 180 rounds a minute in short bursts. It had a sustained rate of fire about 80 rounds per minute. Maximum horizontal range was 8,000 meters. Theoretically, it could reach a target at an altitude of 19,000 feet, but its actual maximum effective range was more like 3,000 meters, and most gun crews didn't open fire until the target was about 1,500 yards away. It fired a 1.5-pound shell manually loaded from 5-round clips. So although it had a good rate of fire and it traversed very quickly, in reality, its lack of sophistication in the gun sight meant that the M38-39 had a lot of difficulty engaging high-speed crossing targets. So you'd generally find the guns positioned around approach azimuths or in large numbers all around a target with very narrow engagement lanes. The Misty pilots described the 37mm as looking like orange softballs that come up towards you in 5-round bursts. The last main type of gun was the towed 23mm ZSU-23, which consisted of two 23mm cannons on a 2-wheel carriage. A single gunner would aim that at the target over open sights again. The loader fed the weapon from 50-round belts. Generally, each towed gun had a sustained rate of fire of about 200 rounds a minute. Theoretically, you could get a maximum rate of 1,000 rounds per barrel, but very few engagements lasted more than 15 seconds. The gun barrels would just overheat if anybody tried to put 1,000 rounds through them in a minute. ZSU-23 could reach up to 16,000 feet in theory, but normally it was restricted to 1,500 or 2,000. Normally, a 4-gun battery would open fire at a range of about 1,000 meters. Misty veterans taught new pilots that the 23mm would give its position away very readily, as every 50 rounds or so, the cordite would accumulate in the gun barrels and ignite, marking the position. As I said, the guns were only important because the North Vietnamese only really deployed them when they had a target to protect. One of Misty's favourite tactics was therefore to hope to tempt the gun crews to fire at them, and therefore identify where there might be something of interest that Misty eyes hadn't already picked out. Over time, both sides came to understand the nature of this game. If the guns fired, then the chances were that Misty would be back with a strike package and a deadly duel would ensue. If they stayed silent, then maybe everyone lives for another day. Even if Misty didn't come back, the gun crew would still have to lug the weapon somewhere else, and who can really be bothered with that? US aviators certainly weren't going to make life easy for anyone. When they were over the route pack, they would always have upwards of 2.5 G on the aircraft to make them a harder target for enemy heavy AA. It's quite surprising that with all the constant jinking, the backseaters were able to spot anything. Being a Misty was like being an airborne detective. learning the behaviors of the enemy and sniffing them out. They flew over the known trails in unpredictable S-curves, scanning the area around them. If the weather was bad with a low overcast, then the Mistys could go out to sea and then race back in under the cloud deck as fast as they could, confident that they wouldn't hit a hill and hopeful that speed and surprise would mean they could avoid getting tagged by the guns. Having accumulated some good targets, they would then go back south, pick up a tanker, and refuel before returning. Along the way, they'd be in communication with ABCCC, an airborne command and control aircraft, which would be able to frag fighter bombers to Misty if they were available and the higher-ups were feeling generous. These heavily modified C-130s ran the air war in Laos and South Vietnam. There were always 2 airborne, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The day shift was Cricket or Hillsborough, the night shift Moonbeam and Alley Cat. As they motored back towards the target area, no loitering, the Misty would get in touch with the strike aircraft, rendezvousing with them at about 20,000 feet, well above the guns. In an ideal situation, the Misty would be able to show the strike aircraft how to locate the target via some sort of obvious waypoint. Things were rarely ideal, so the Mistys would then roll in and mark the target with rockets. The book technique for this had the Misty roll in from about 8,500 feet into a 45-degree dive, firing rockets at 5,500 feet and then pulling out smartly in a 4G turn before the guns could engage. Although this may well have been what the Misty pilots told the weapons school guys writing the manual, in reality they went in much lower in order to accurately hit the right target with their smoke rockets. After the pass, they would then resume orbiting at 10,000 feet to see how the attackers did. Hit my smoke was always the instruction, and then the strikers would make their own passes. Accounts from Mistys contain rather a lot of frustration about the attitudes and accuracy of their colleagues. It's a difficult one to judge. Missions in Route Pack 1 were counters for pilots, meaning that they ticked off one more mission towards the 100 that sent them home. Since there were no radar-directed weapons in Route Pack 1 and SAMs only appeared much later, it was very tempting to bomb from altitude with no risk and then RTB to tick off that mission. Misty pilots seemed to feel that F4 crews were most guilty of this, and even if they did attempt to dive bomb from a realistic altitude, the F4 was not a particularly good bombing platform. A lot of jungle got blown up. Misty's favourites were the F-105s, which were sadly rarely available because they were tied up in the northern route packs. Navy aviators were also well liked, although they were only fragged to Misty if the action strayed into Route Pack 2. Weapons varied, although the fact that most of the targets were hidden in the trees meant that general-purpose bombs were most effective. If trucks were caught in the open, then Snake and Nape was a great option, as was CBU. SAM sites got the treatment as well when they began to pop up in 1968 and 69. After the attack was concluded, the Misty would go back south and refuel again. Bomb damage assessment would wait for a later pass or the next Misty. Multiple passes increased the already high level of risk. Missions could be as long as 6 hours, flying back in and out of the pack looking for targets. After a number of accidents in 69, the limit was adjusted to 4 hours as the leadership was worried about fatigue leading to mistakes being made. The most spectacular Misty success came on March the 20th, 1968. Don Shepperd and Lanny Lancaster were tooling around in Route Pack 1 in terrible weather and decided to take a look into Pack 2 where the weather was clearing. This wasn't strictly within the rules, as Route Pack 2 was the Navy's responsibility, but hey-ho. As they crossed into Route Pack 2, they immediately spotted a huge convoy of trucks, which had also been surprised by the sudden change in weather and found themselves exposed in the road. Lancaster estimated that there were as many as 200 trucks. Misty usually got excited by 2. He called Cricket, then pushed forward to buzz the trucks in the hope that the drivers would flee, leaving the supplies stranded. But the drivers accelerated, rolling south. So Lancaster strafed the first truck, which had the desired effect. When the first truck stopped, many drivers now decided that discretion was the better part of valor and did a runner. Shepperd and Lancaster kept flying low over the convoy, firing the occasional rocket to keep the North Vietnamese honest until support arrived. 2 F-4s were first on the scene, armed with an unusual arrangement of bullpup air-to-ground missiles. Misty got whatever happened to be around or diverted because of the weather over another target, and they'd learned not to be too choosy. The flight leader rolled in, but his missile flew into the ground, not an unusual circumstance. He tried again, and again the missile failed to guide. Shepperd and Lancaster could well have been forgiven for frustration at this moment, but the second F-4 crew was much more successful. Their first missile hit right at the back of the convoy, destroying 3 trucks, vaporizing a section of road and bottling the rest in on the narrow road. As the F-4s departed, Navy Corsairs arrived. These were much more serious CAS aircraft, and they set about the convoy with cluster bombs. The Misty crew didn't have the fuel for a full bomb damage assessment, but they counted 79 destroyed trucks before they had to return to base. As it happens, their tanker had itself had to return to base, so the Mistys had to divert to Ubon in Thailand. Next day, more strikes obliterated the cleanup crews sent to salvage things from the wreckage, further increasing the haul. Increasingly strong ground defences meant that rescuing fellow pilots started to take up more and more time. Mistys were the only non-rescue unit certified to be an on-scene commander for a rescue attempt, mostly because they were rescapping other Mistys who'd been shot down and therefore had plenty of experience. In those situations, the Misty crew might go for as long as those 8 hours. Towards the end of the mission, during the bombing pause of the late 1960s, rescap took up more than 30% of Misty time. From the word go in the summer of 1967, they uncovered surprising realities about how the North Vietnamese were able to operate in the forests. An early revelation was that there were trains operating in Route Pack 1. 7th Air Force were incredulous, as in their minds they'd knocked out the trains in 1965. But no, the Mistys brought back photographic evidence of how the Vietnamese were covering the tracks in the day and then re-erecting the railroad every night. In the early months, the Mistys would launch 4 sorties a day, but this soon changed to 7 per day, 7 days a week, starting at sunrise and ending at sunset. They started at Misty 1-1 and they went through to 7-1. Sometimes, when the weather was bad, F-105s would come back from Route Pack 6 fully loaded with bombs and get on the radio to Misty. Those guys would indicate a target, usually by tempting the gunners protecting it to open up with their guns, and then the thuds would come in and flatten the whole area. The most productive flights of the day would usually be Misty 1-1 and then 6-1 and 7-1 at the end of the day. Inevitably, some of the overnight truck moves would hang up on something like a river crossing, or they just wouldn't be camouflaged quickly enough. The dawn light also produced maximum contrast and made it easiest to see things on the ground. At the end of the day, it seemed that some commanders wanted to get the night's supply movements underway early. A sharp FAC could get them before nightfall. The Mistys did try to operate at night. To facilitate this, they were given a new Starlight scope in June of 1968, a 40-pound device that kind of worked in ideal situations. Being thrown around in the back of an F-100F and looking through the curved canopy glass, it was largely useless. And in any case, none of the US tactical bombers could reliably find and hit a target at night, so night missions were the exception, not the rule. Even so, the higher-ups decided that Su-25s should be issued to Mistys in an attempt to expand the mission. The Su-25 is a flare pod. The F-100s flew 46 night sorties in Route Pack 1 between the 12th of July and the 18th of August. Although it might have been tough to hit anything, the test helped the Mistys discover the North Vietnamese pattern at night. They were also awestruck by the sheer number of trucks that would emerge at dusk and take to the roads. Massed in hidden parks along the highways, they would move out and assemble at staging areas capable of holding more than 200 vehicles. There they would spread out under the thick jungle overhang and try to make it into Laos the second night. To counter the heavy attacks on choke points, the communists waited until a major movement was ready, then worked to open up only the essential roads. It was a remarkable enterprise to observe, unseen from high above the route pack, free of interference from AA fire. Misty Night controllers likewise discovered the mystery of a feature called the Missing Bridge. Route 101 crossed the Song Trok River at Phong Choi, a major bottleneck 20 miles northwest of Dong Hoi. Day reconnaissance showed no bridge spanning the river at this point, yet trucks were seen rolling down the highway. The puzzle was solved one night when a Misty saw the North Vietnamese float a huge pontoon bridge from a cave several thousand yards away and place it across the stream. The Mistys also learned that from 5,000 feet they could scarcely make out the soft glowing blue headlights used on the enemy trucks. If they went in lower, then the orbiting strike aircraft would be unable to see their targets, adding further frustration even if enemies were spotted and the strikers were available. 7th Air Force halted jet night FAC activity on the 16th of October 1968 after problems began to outweigh achievements. Even under flare light, it was extremely difficult during strike control to detect the smoke of the marker rockets. Only if the strike pilot saw the rocket impact point could he be sure of the target's general location. Moreover, flares made poor markers. They couldn't be aimed for accuracy, and their light eliminated the element of surprise. What's more, the Su-25 carried too few flares for proper operations, and the F-100's TACAN and ADF for getting fixes also proved unreliable below 10,000 feet mean sea level in Laos and North Vietnam. Night operations were one of several new missions and tactics that Misty took on in 1968. For starters, the volume of traffic through the route pack was growing at a huge rate. The year had opened with the Tet Offensive, which came as a surprise to the US High Command, but may well have been less surprising had Misty and other recon assets been listened to. Tanks had been seen in Route Pack 1 late in 1967, but the reports had been dismissed as pilots getting overexcited. Photos had been inconclusive. It was obvious to the Mistys that large numbers of regular North Vietnamese troops had been moving south, but although they were close to the action and a favourite intelligence source, they were not running the war. As Tet began to run out of steam, attention turned to developing new assets to improve Misty's effectiveness. One simple piece of technology was to create and issue a laminated map book for pilots. The backseater could easily flip through this and mark what he saw in grease pencil. Since the Air Force couldn't provide something like this without a multi-year procurement exercise, the Misty intelligence officers made them by laminating paper maps with clear film taken from RF-101 film rolls. More elaborate was a complete picture of Route Pack 1, assembled by painstakingly patching together photos taken by RF-101s and mounting them on a dozen 4-foot by 8-foot panels. Pilots could walk the main transport arteries in the pack ahead of their missions to debrief themselves. If they brought photos back, then those could be compared to the older ones and the giant image updated. It was a remarkable tool, particularly given that it was assembled by scrounging all of the components, including the photos, from other units. On the 30th of November 1968, 7th Air Force opened up the Gulf sector of Steel Tiger to Commando Sabre operations. It decided at the time to begin Misty night operations over Laos, due again to the compelling need for around-the-clock coverage of the enemy road network. They commenced the night missions in December under set restrictions. They would only fly when ground fire grew too hot for the slower FAC aircraft and few planes were in the target area. Along with ABCCC control and radar flight following, they required an approved working altitude, ranging from ground level to 2,000 feet. Unable to meet all of these conditions and the new missions, the Mistys flew on waivers that took them beyond the allowed 60 missions. 100 was the new maximum, although this too was busted through. I believe 107 was the record. They also began to coordinate with Navy cruisers, firing 8-inch guns from offshore at coastal targets during Sea Dragon. Later on, New Jersey also joined in with 16-inch broadsides. These were spectacular, but totally ineffective. The closest the battleship managed to put a salvo was a mile away from the target. As political will in the US waned, interdiction of supplies in the upper route packs declined. The North Vietnamese had more things to move south and more sophisticated weapons available with which to defend them. The later months of 1968 therefore brought even more dangers. The Mistys were not really strangers to SAMs, although they were nothing like as experienced in their ways as those going up north. In February 1968, Don Shepperd and Jim Fiorelli had seen something streak 1,000 feet in front of their aircraft. It looked like a flaming lance, long and needle-thin. And it was, in fact, an SA-7 Grail man-portable SAM, presumably one of the first produced and certainly one of the first sent to Vietnam. Fortunately, the operator clearly didn't know what they were doing. On March the 7th, Don Shepperd was at it again, more deliberately this time, with Carroll Williams in his back seat. They were tasked, or rather they had tasked themselves, with a SAM hunt, and successfully located a battery being moved northeast into the Mugaya Pass. They went off to refuel and then returned, with 3 flights of F-105s diverted from a strike going to Hanoi en route to them. This was the good news. The bad news was that many F-100Fs, this one included, had no raw gear, and thus, although they couldn't see the Phan Rang radar truck that guided the missiles, that didn't mean it wasn't there. And in due course, they observed a bright flash on the ground, followed by a plume of smoke. Most of the pilots you hear from about Vietnam are the F-4 and F-105 guys. They knew all about SAMs. The same training wasn't really a thing for the F-100 crews who operated far away from the SA-2 areas. Shepperd had, however, overheard people talking about what to do, so he pushed the Sabre into a negative G maneuver and turned to get the missile at their 3 o'clock position. The entire contents of the cockpit, maps, cameras, radios, and a lot of dirt, flew upwards towards the canopy as he did this. Fortunately, it worked. The SAM lost track, went ballistic in a wild corkscrew. The thuds flattened the site and its defending guns. Although the Mistys had success in finding SAM sites, usually before they were active, the fact of the matter was that the F-100F was unsuited to operating in a high-threat environment. It lacked effective raw gear and it couldn't carry jammers or chaff dispensers. Their only defense was the usual Misty tactic of flying on the deck with their asses on fire. But this too was becoming ever more dangerous as more and more guns found their way down south. On October the 30th, 1968, Misty pilot Frank Kimball strafed 2 trucks in Route Pack 1. These, it would turn out, were the last 2 targets destroyed by Misty in North Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson announced the bombing pause on the 31st, and Rolling Thunder was at an end. Misty moved south, but the need for FAC was no longer as acute, and in any case, the F-100s were both tired out, increasingly few in number as attrition took its toll on an aging fleet, and electronically ill-equipped to continue the battle against the sophisticated enemy. As the US sought a conclusion to the war through negotiation, blowing up some trucks and guns seemed counter to the grand strategy that was supposedly playing out. Misty was officially shuttered on May the 14th, 1970. In truth, it had been philosophically deceased for about 18 months. Before they went away, though, there was time for one last glorious victory. In February 1970, 2 very experienced Mistys, Jake Daub and Mike Hinkle, were checking out a mountainous area of Steel Tiger. They were the last flight of the day, and the light was only going to last for another hour or so. Even so, they saw a suspicious cloud of red dust billowing up from the jungle, and as they neared, they saw a huge work crew of NVA busy shoveling the road. One of the great mysteries of the campaign in the southern route packs was how the North Vietnamese managed to repair the roads from frequent mudslides and bombs when heavy machinery was rarely seen. Here, below the Misty crew, was the answer. Manpower. Lots of manpower. And better still, they showed no signs that they had spotted the Super Sabre high above them. Daub got on the radio to the controller and got a flight of F-4s fragged to him. He marked with smoke, and the fighter bombers rolled in immediately. The effect of their bombs was spectacular. A huge section of the cliff over the road collapsed onto the work crews. The Misty crew estimated that as many as 1,000 NVA soldiers were killed by the twin effects of high explosives and landslides. It was amongst the most successful single air attacks of the war in terms of kill count, a horrific toll. One of the many remarkable things about Misty is the caliber of the men who served with it. For such a small unit, it is surprising how many went on to big things within and outside the Air Force. 2 former Mistys became Air Force Chief of Staff. Merrill McPeak served in that role from 1990 to 1993, whereupon he was replaced by Ronald Fogelman. Remarkably, given the unit's reputation for bending rules, 4 other Mistys also attained general's rank. Although they were frustrated by the artificial constraints put on them, these were real warriors, trying to win a war, not just survive it. Amongst other accomplishments, Dick Killer Rutan, who flew 325 combat missions in Vietnam, was one of the pilots of Voyager and flew it around the world without refueling in December 1986. Another notable pilot was Don Kilgus, who scored the F-100's only air-to-air kill against a MiG-17 in 1965. He went on to become a wild weasel. In 1970, he covered the Sontai raid as Firebird 5, was shot down and rescued by the Jolly Green Giants. He was awarded the Silver Star for his skill and bravery on that mission. 4 Mistys became POWs. Brigadier General Bud Day, Misty 1, spent 2,028 days in captivity. Colonel Bob Craner, Misty 17, spent 1,920 days in captivity. Tragically, he died of a heart attack in 1980, aged just 47. Captain Guy Grutters, Misty 29, was shot down on December the 20th, 1967, and spent 1,912 days as a POW. And then Colonel Paul K. Robinson, Misty 45, completed his 100-mission tour as a Misty, but was shot down flying an F-4 over Hanoi on July the 1st, 1972. He spent 270 days in captivity. And tragically, 7 Mistys died flying with the unit. Howie Williams was killed on the 18th of March, 1968. His remains were finally identified and repatriated in 1992, although the exact circumstances of his death remain unclear. Majors Michael McHellenon and John Overlock disappeared on August 16, 1968. No trace of them has ever been found. Lee Gawley and Scott Dotson vanished on August the 9th, 1969 over Laos. Their remains were located in late 2001 at the crash site. Pat Carroll and Larry Whitford went down in Laos on November the 2nd, 1969. Although the crash site was later found, no trace of either man has ever come to light. The Misty was out on the trail from dawn to dusk. They had a single mission: to stop traffic on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. To prosecute that mission, they were given control over the targets to be attacked by the fighter bombers attached to them without recourse to higher command. Ultimately, their mission was a failure. Although they could stop traffic during the day, the lack of night vision and infrared sensors and precision attack weapons meant that interdiction at night was essentially impossible to achieve. Rules of engagement that prevented intense bombing of Hanoi, connecting railroads into China and the vital port at Haiphong, meant that supplies could not be stopped at the source. Although it could be regarded as a futile mission performed by brave men, I choose to regard Commando Sabre as the start of a revolution in air warfare. In the soul searching that followed Vietnam, the US Air Force realized that in any future war they would need to be able to deny their enemy sanctuary in the dark or behind integrated defenses as well as in daytime. By the 1980s, technology like Lantern was being deployed to facilitate all-weather strikes, accompanied by laser-guided bombs and stealth aircraft to take on integrated defense systems. On the 17th of January 1991, the first demonstration of the lessons they had learned began in the deserts of Iraq.